Hi, folks. Thanks for having me again. My name is Emilia, and I'm the head of marketing at UserPilot, a product growth platform for product people in SaaS. And today I will be talking about a metric that is actually essential for SaaS businesses, but that is very difficult to define and measure. What am I going to talk about? User activation, of course. User activation is particularly interesting. Let me share my screen so I can show you my presentation. Um, because it affects all the other metrics, all the other pirate metrics. It has this knock-on effect. Because if you don't manage to activate your users, so make them see the value and actually start using your product, well, they probably won't stick around. So let's start. Who am I? As I mentioned, I'm the head of marketing at UserPilot. I have been since the beginning of this year. And formerly, I was a marketing manager at Post4T for a while, who was UserPilot's customer. So I will be using some examples from my previous business here, basically, to illustrate what activation is. Let's have a look at what we are going to talk about today. So first we will define user activation and why it is important for SaaS. What is the impact of activation on revenue in SaaS? This is something that we all want to achieve, higher revenue growth. And what is user activation rate? Right? So how to calculate it, I will show you a simple formula. Then we'll discuss briefly the challenges in actually calculating user activation. So, like how it's different between different segments or different, plans of your product, for instance. What are user activation rate benchmarks in B2B versus B2C in SaaS? And how to improve user activation. So actually something very, very actionable. And finally, I will share some conclusions with you. So let's crack on. What is user activation? So activation can be defined as the moment when your user performs the key events, also called the key activation events or activation points in your product that allow them to experience the value of your product for their specific use case. Right. So in other words, basically what the user needs to do to get the results they want to get from your product. So as you can already sense, the difficulty in measuring user activation is that it will be operationalized differently, not only for every business and every product, but also for different use cases, personas, or even user segments within your product. Right, so this is what makes it so challenging to actually define. Let me just quickly put my phone on flight mode because I have a feeling somebody will be calling me and I forgot to do that. Sorry, I'm back. Okay, so let's have a look at an example, an email marketing tool. I have worked for an email marketing tool SaaS as well. So a typical email marketing tool has a number of different types of users and different jobs to be done. So you may have a blogger that is just starting out and wants to use the tool to collect subscribers for their blog. You may have an e-commerce store owner with several hundreds or hundreds of thousands of subscribers that are switching from a different tool that wasn't really meeting their needs anymore. And who wants to start sending newsletters straight away, unlike the blogger who cannot send any newsletters because they don't have any subscribers yet, right? So let's have a look at how the activation point will be different for these different types of users. So for the first type of user, the blogger who wants to only collect new subscribers, the key activation points will be probably creating their first sign-up form, embedding it on their blog, collecting their first subscribers. On the other hand, for the e-commerce business owner, it may be updating their, uploading their email list, creating their first newsletter, and actually sending it to their first email list, and then maybe looking at the analytics. So as you can see, already for the same product, a pretty simple product in a well-known established market, we have defined activation points very differently for different user segments. Okay, let's have a look at an example of how you can actually find that information out from your users. So you can define the activation point for them and know who actually has activated in a particular segment and who has not. So ConvertKit created this simple survey in their welcome screen. Right? Do you currently use an email marketing tool in your business? Yes, I'm moving from another one. No, I'm not. And then depending on what the user actually says in the welcome screen, they will get a different basically onboarding flow. Why is activation important for SaaS? Well, it's self-explanatory that if your users don't activate, they're not going to stick around. But let's have a look at this pretty interesting table, research from Fair Market. So which metric has the biggest impact on the increase of MRR after 12 months if this metric increases by 25%? So as you can see here, activation, an increase of 25% contributes to 34% increase in MRR, unlike the other metrics, right? So acquisition has the more or less the same impact on MRR, revenue as well. Retention has almost as high impact as activation, right? And referrals have a fairly small impact relatively. So as you can see, activation has the biggest impact on MRR. Why? Obviously, as I just mentioned, people who don't activate usually churn. Right. So if you look at it, if you kind of reverse engineer this logic, activation affects MRR by the factor of 1.34 compared to 1 for acquisition and only 0.3 for referrals, right? So it's a marked difference. Everybody's talking about word of mouth, right? But actually, when you look at the data, the biggest impact on your MRR comes from activation. What is user activation rate and how to measure it? So quite obviously, number of activated users divided by a total number of users in a particular period of time equals activation rate. But that becomes a bit more complicated when you account for that the definition of activation differs for every persona, every product, every plan of your product, job to be done, and use case. So you would need to run this calculation for actually each of the different segments in which you operationalized and defined activation for differently. Right. So what about industry benchmarks? If you define activation differently, can you actually have industry benchmarks the way you can, for instance, compare net promoter score, your NPS, between different businesses in the same sector? Well, not really. I've seen a lot of attempts to actually compare activation rates between different industry sectors, but I would say that's comparing apples to oranges, because as you saw, even within the same product, activation rate definitions will be very different. Right, so we've tried to do that. We asked our users what is their current activation rate on average, and as you can see, the distribution of responses was very far from normal. So we suspect that people didn't really get what activation is. Right, how do you define user activation in your product? As you can see, well, people gave very different answers. So everybody had a different answers. That was expected. Right. How do you define user activation in your product? Well, and this was an interesting answer. Again, I don't think we actually have a definition for this, right? Lots of things it could be, but not true definition. Okay, so a lot of our users were actually confused how to define activation in their own product. So, as I mentioned before, I don't think there is a valid benchmark for activation. Change my mind. If you have arguments that point to the contrary, please contact me. I would love to discuss it with you and I would love to hear your perspective. Right. So if it's so difficult to measure and it's different for every product, business, use case, persona, should we measure it at all? Well, so the tricky part is yes, we should, because only what gets measured gets managed. And as I mentioned, it actually has the biggest impact on your MRR. So you should really try to improve it, even if it means you will need to create different strategies for improving your activation across different segments or product lines. Right, so now that we got to this point, how can you improve your activation rate? Right, so first of all, define your activation for the different personas and user segments that are really important for you. So for instance, the ones that contribute most to your MRR. Pick the activation events, right, and set completion goals for them. For instance, if you're using a tool like Userpilot, you can easily define the goals of certain activity. So for instance, let's take a social media scheduler like Postfitty. For Postfitty, the key activation points will be adding social media accounts to the platform and scheduling a first post. Right, so as you can see, for scheduling the first post, the goal was 75%. Postfitty wanted 75% of its new users to schedule their first post within a week. And as you can see, they haven't quite reached that goal yet. But then if they know what they want to achieve and they know what is the current achievement rate of this goal, they can create experiences that will lead more users to adopting this goal and thus increasing the activation rate. Right, so before you create any experiences, you need to pass custom events and so the key activation events to your product adoption platform. For instance, Userpilot, but you can use any others. I wouldn't recommend custom coding your basically in-app activation experiences because it would be a terrible lot of work and it would actually cost you more than subscribing to an adoption platform. Basically, you need to experiment a lot in order to figure out what actually contributes to improving your activation. That's why custom coding everything and then changing it all the time in response to the data you've collected will be a lot more work. Right, so the first thing you should do once you have defined your activation, once you have created your goals, once you have passed your key activation events to your product adoption platform, is to create an interactive walkthrough that will guide more users towards the particular action they need to take in order to activate. So in the case of Postfitty, connecting the social media accounts, that was basically leading them to connect more social media accounts. As you can see, well, it's pointing to the second activation event here, the interactive walkthrough, so scheduling their first social media post as well. And then you need to make sure if you're creating an interactive walkthrough that displaying the second step, the second condition, so the second key activation event that will lead the users to activation, so understanding the value and getting the value of your product, happens sequentially. So it doesn't happen linearly as it would in a traditional linear step-by-step product tour, but that actually the second step in the walkthrough is triggered by completion of the first step, right? So we don't want to push the users to do to take step 2 before they have even taken step 1. Right. And importantly, you need to A/B test. So basically, in order to see if your interactive walkthrough is working or not, you need to create a few variations of these walkthroughs, maybe changing your copy, maybe changing your steps in the walkthrough in order to see what is working best. Right. So you should always choose, as in the case of any experiments, you should choose the same treatment group. you should have the same operationalized dependent variable, so activation. And then you should just choose a different experimental condition. So, well, different variants of the same experience. Postfitty did that. They actually looked at how the interactive walkthrough helps the users adopt these key features, so key activation points. In the case of an A/B test against nothing, so against basically null condition, they could see that the walkthrough contributed to twice as much activation, so twice as much as high goal completion as not having any walkthrough at all. So this was promising. But then, of course, they could still experiment with different conditions, right? And what next? How do you confirm that your experiences that lead to higher activation actually move the needle? You need to use cohort analysis for that and basically track your users over time, see basically how improving activation actually affects retention over time. That's where you see the ROI of creating activation experiences and the real impact of this elusive metric on your bottom line. And that's it. If you want to get some help with creating experiments to improve your activation rate, or basically defining your activation and key activation points, drop me a line at amelia@userpilot.co and we'll be happy to continue the conversation with you and, of course, to help you improve your activation. Let me know if this was helpful. I will see you again, hopefully, at another event. And yeah, looking forward to chatting to you again. Good luck with your experiments. Bye-bye.